It is incredible to think that these scenes took place in the center of Kyiv. But this is what the Ukrainian capital looked like on January 22, 2014. The crowds had been on the streets since November, demanding the removal of President Viktor Yanukovych. But that day the crisis entered a new phase. 5 people died and hundreds were injured. I myself was cut on the leg by fragments of a stun grenade. All week we reported live, day and night, from the burning barricades. The temperature dropped to minus 20 Celsius. The most tragic point came a month later. It started with fighting in a government quarter. A peaceful demonstration had soon deteriorated into mass disorder in which at least 20 people died. On Shovkovichna Street hundreds of people were involved. I filmed them as they captured policemen and started stripping them of their equipment. It was a short-lived victory. That night the riot police returned and surrounded the Maidan. 2 days later, 77 people were shot dead by uniformed security forces, but the crowds were determined and Yanukovych was forced to flee the country. But the next crisis was quick in coming. In Crimea, unknown armed men appeared and took over official buildings. They were to become known as the Little Green Men. They wore uniforms but no insignia. I came to Crimea during the so-called referendum. Many people were happy to vote and celebrated the news that they would be joining Russia. Ukrainian troops stationed in Crimea were pushed out almost without a shot being fired. One soldier was killed when a base in Simferopol was stormed. Others were injured.
Когда стоишь перед несколькими десятками вооруженных людей, я вышел без оружия, естественно, как нормальный человек, себя чувствуешь неуютно. Но тем не менее, мы люди военные, мы обязаны выполнять приказы. Мы давали присягу, поэтому будем выполнять, будем стоять до конца, пока нам не поступит другого приказа.
The feeling towards Ukrainian journalists in Crimea at this time was extremely negative. I myself was kidnapped by gunmen while filming Russian soldiers. I survived, but my footage was lost. Luckily, my colleagues at RFE were able to capture these historic events. Within weeks, the epicenter of the drama had moved again, to eastern Ukraine. I arrived when pro-government forces were going on the offensive against Russian-backed separatists who had seized control of large areas of territory. It seemed like victory was near. But then came the battle for Ilovaisk. On August 11th, as we approached Ilovaisk, 6 soldiers were killed and 10 wounded. It was a dark day. Later, the commander explained what went wrong.
Нам не вистачило сил і не було такої мети за будь-яку ціну захопити це місто. Тобто ми зрозуміли, що вони дуже сильно укріплені і вони не відходять. Тому ми, провівши цю розвідку бою, фактично відступили назад для того, щоб перегрупуватись, зробити новий план і по-новому захопити місто.
Hundreds of Ukrainian men were to die in the battle that followed this action. A Ukrainian general said it was the first time the Russians had deployed regular troops to the fighting. Eventually, the Ukrainians were forced to retreat. We went with them. In September, a ceasefire was announced, but it was not observed. We were in the village of Nikishino when it came under intense attack. It was one of the most dangerous places on the front. The Ukrainian positions were under attack every day for several weeks. The war had never been closer. Sometimes the two sides were less than 100 meters apart, and the Ukrainian forces had orders not to conduct offensive operations, so they could only hold their positions in the cellars and abandoned houses.
Попри так званий режим припинення вогню, лінія фронту на Донбасі зберігається, і зараз вона проходить саме тут, в селі Нікішине, що за десяток кілометрів на схід від Дебальцевого. Уже п'ятий день бійці 11-го батальйону територіальної оборони відбивають невпинні атаки сепаратистів.
And so it went on. In November, I visited another battlefield, the village of Piski, near Donetsk airport. 2,000 people once lived here, now there are just 100.
Ни воды, ни света, ни отопления, ничего нет. Мы живем как цыгане. Солнце стало утро, солнце село вечер.
The fighting largely stopped by mid-December, though not entirely. A new ceasefire was announced as fighters continued battling freezing temperatures. But the past year in Ukraine has shown how quickly peace and stability can erupt into the flames of violence and war.